one of the reviews, at the time, called me a pornographer of violence. Made me think about my career.
Yeah, right.
Well,
This is actually a very well-made movie, but at regular intervals, no doubt about it, it does gross one out.
I think that's probably an understatement. I would call this the barf bag movie of July.
All the people started getting sick and throwing up all over each other. I never felt so bad in my entire life.
When John Carpenter's The Thing hit theaters in 1982, it shocked audiences, disgusted critics, and one scene in particular even caused an infamous incident where a woman barfed right in front of the studio head's wife. But what made this scene so powerful, and how was it created?
I don't know what the hell's in there, but it's weird and pissed off, whatever it is.
In this video, we'll dive into The Thing's kennel scene, the strong reaction audiences and critics had in 1982, how the brilliantly nauseating effects were done, and why The Thing transformed from the barf bag movie of July to the classic it is today. This is the story of the scene that made audiences walk out of The Thing. The scene unfolds in the novella much like it does in the movie, the main difference being that the creature that was frozen in the block of ice escaped and specifically targeted the dogs strategically because they are the life forms at the base that are best suited to deal with the cold. The Thing's original form, at least when it came to Earth, is described as having 3 red eyes. And here we can see some concepts for that form by the movie's storyboard artist, Mike Ploog. In the story, the Thing is attacked and wounded by the dogs as it tries to imitate them, and then is killed when discovered by the humans. In Bill Lancaster's script for the 1982 movie, the dog thing is only described in vague terms. The flashlight illuminates part of some thing, a dog, but not quite. Impossible to tell, it struggles powerfully. In order to maintain his creativity to the fullest, Lancaster didn't think about how the effects would actually be done while he was writing, saying, "Basically, I just wrote with no holds barred, but in certain sequences I left the details out. Then we would go over the script and make things practical." He hung out with Rob Bottin, who did the makeup effects, Roy Arbogast, who did the mechanical effects, and Mike Ploog, who did the storyboards, and they'd throw different ideas around. Some ideas would be too difficult and they'd try something different, but Lancaster told them to feel free to think up something weirder than was written in the script, considering they had been making crazy stuff all their lives. And the stuff they made was crazy. Just wait till you hear what happened to the wife of head of Universal Sid Sheinberg at the first preview screening. So The Thing is about paranoia, but I know about paranoia all too well. In high school, my anxiety got so bad that I was having daily panic attacks for no clear reason. It got to the point where every time I would leave the house I would feel sick, so I just stopped going. Therapy taught me that thoughts, fears, doubts, reactions are all just patterns, and the more you repeat them, the deeper the groove gets until it feels automatic. For me, it was anxiety, but it can happen with anything. Social media can dig the groove that you're not good enough, bad relationships can reinforce the idea that you don't deserve better, and the news can carve out a path of you feeling angry all the time. These aren't just thoughts, they're well-worn paths that your brain keeps following. Therapy gives you the tools to repair those grooves and create better ones. It helps you understand how your mind works, so you're not just stuck running on autopilot. Therapy used to feel impossible, too expensive, too hard to find the right therapist, too much time. But today's sponsor, BetterHelp, has changed that. Just fill out a quick questionnaire and you'll be matched with a therapist in as little as a couple of days. If it's not the right fit, you can switch anytime at no extra cost. BetterHelp ensures that every therapist is well qualified and their customer support is always there to help. With over 7,000 reviews and a 4.5-star rating on Trustpilot, it's a platform you can trust. Therapy isn't just for rich people anymore. And it isn't a sign of weakness, it's you taking control. If you ever felt stuck in your own head, I really recommend giving it a shot. You can get 10% off your first month at betterhelp.com/cinematyler, and the link's in the description. Alright, back to The Thing, because the story of the first screening, it's wild. They first tested the movie in late May at Red Rock Theater in Las Vegas, and producer Stuart Cohen said that earlier that day, they were relieved to find out that the movie got an R rating instead of the X rating they were worried about. This meant that they wouldn't have to cut anything, but it didn't necessarily mean that the movie wasn't too gory.
there was one picture that the MPAA wanted to rate X for a certain couple of violent scenes. But luckily, I was with a major studio. The strange thing is the major studio simply called them on the phone and said no.
The studio executives, including the head of Universal, Sid Sheinberg, and his wife, took a private jet to Las Vegas to see the movie for the first time.
We had a few previews, and the first one we had, it's unbelievable. The audience is packed, and all the Universal executives are sitting there, and it's one of these terrible times. Sid Sheinberg is there, and Ned Tannen is sitting there. And during the dog scene, you're in the kennel, and all these dogs are acting up, and all of a sudden this dog splits open, and this lady, and she heads to the bathroom. And Sid Sheinberg's wife, the lady in Jaws, was in the bathroom at the time, and I guess this lady just threw right up, right there on the floor, and we had a serious problem. A serious problem. It was too intense, literally too intense.
According to producer Stuart Cohen, the kennel scene actually got applause, but maybe some were applauding that it was over. The funny thing is that at this first preview, Carpenter was sitting in the back and had a box that could control the volume for the whole theater. Carpenter was laughing and raising the volume anytime something scary was about to happen. In this part, where Blair snaps off part of the dog thing, the sound was as loud as a rifle blast. But as Blair's autopsy of the dog thing went on, people were walking out. And the same thing happened the next night. It seems that people realized that the kennel scene was just the beginning of the horrifying and disgusting effects that were yet to come. The people who stayed were mostly quiet except for some nervous laughter and applause after a few of the major scenes. According to special effects wizard Rob Bottin, after the first screening, he overheard some young guys who apparently thought they really killed dogs for the movie. Bottin said, "I heard one guy ask the other, 'Did you see what they did to those poor dogs?' But what I heard the other guy reply I thought was even funnier, in a sick kind of way. He said, 'Yeah, but it was necessary. Like we wasted live dogs for realism.'" Bottin felt weirdly proud of the reaction because it meant that the effect worked. After the screening, the Universal executives, Carpenter, the producers, and the editor met in a small conference room at the Caesars Palace Hotel to go through the feedback cards. People thought that the special effects were convincing, but maybe a little too convincing. Many were offended by the amount of gore in the movie, and Carpenter was asked by the executives if he would consider toning it down more in the edit.
Honestly, in this kind of film, you're dealing with something that the whole audience knows isn't real at all. I want the audience to believe it.
Yeah.
When they see that, say, "Oh my Lord, look at that, that's
Yeah.
real."
Yeah.
According to Stuart Cohen, Carpenter politely said that the effects needed to be that way for the story to work, and the studio didn't bug him about it after that. But apparently, word got out about the effects.
About 2 weeks ago, something very unusual happened to me. I began getting postcards at my newspaper office from readers telling me that John Carpenter's new movie, I guess they'd seen it in a preview, was one of the most disgusting films ever made. Well, those postcard writers certainly were right about one thing. The movie The Thing does contain a lot of repellent special effects.
After a special screening just for the team and their families, Matte painter Albert Whitlock was actually angry at the amount of gore in the movie and confronted Stuart Cohen about it, saying that his wife actually walked out during the kennel scene. Whitlock said in an interview, "I told John that it should have a new title, Slaughterhouse 6. I know that death is death and there are horrible things, but I don't have to go to the movies to see it. You use it as a theme, but you don't hit people over the head with it." Cohen said that it was jarring to hear this reaction from somebody who actually worked on the movie. Even Kurt Russell told Cohen right after seeing the movie for the first time that he felt that they had cut out a lot of the character building in favor of the quote-unquote ick factor. Some in the cast seemed to agree, thinking that their characters were made one-dimensional by the focus on the monster in the edit. Even Carpenter's friend Deborah Hill later said in an interview with Starburst magazine, "It became more Rob Bottin's picture than John's," and went on to say that she would have liked to know more about the characters because she didn't feel anything for them. In that interview, she noted that Carpenter had more scenes with character development that were either rewritten or ultimately cut from the movie. Of course, much like with the general public, this view has changed over time. But interestingly, film critic Gene Siskel seemed to get it immediately.
I have some problems with it. One of them is, I think, the characters. They're not made into three-dimensional people. Their function is to walk down the corridor and be jumped on. So that the story is totally implausible, and the movie just basically is an excuse for this very gruesome and repellent creature to gross us out. It is the most nauseating thing I've ever seen on a movie screen, I think.
That's quite a statement.
I think I'll stand behind it.
I think that the movie for me, though, isn't about those characters as individual people. I think that's why they can be interchangeable. I think that it's about how a society, this little group here, wants to poison, they think something's going wrong, you're not in the group, you're out, move, just that line, move away to one side. It's a very chilling thing.
All right, Doc, Gary and Clark, move over there away from the others.
And I think if you read the movie in that way, then the implausibilities at your level mean very little. And so you sit there wishing, and I do wish, that it were a lot cleaner.
Well, I think, Gene, though, that I've got news for you, and that is that 99% of the people who go to see this movie are there to see the monsters, and very few of them are going to read it as your kind of allegory of McCarthyism.
That we will see.
In an upcoming episode, we'll look at how the men were purposefully made to look similar in their parkas, have little to no backstory, and how this relates to the movie's themes. The effects were staged by 22-year-old special effects master Rob Bottin, alongside John Carpenter and cinematographer Dean Cundey. During the production, there was a lot of pressure from Universal to cut down on the cost, but Carpenter knew how important and complex bringing a shape-shifting monster to life would be, and championed Bottin's requests at every turn.
Is this the first time ever for some of these effects?
I think so. I don't think you'll ever see effects like this in a movie. I know there hasn't been a monster movie like this, where the monster constantly changes form. It never looks like any one thing. It's constantly in motion. And it's pretty hard to pull off, but I think we've done all right.
There's a scene in The Thing, Rob Bottin, who did the special effects, who's a really tremendous artist, came to me and said, you know, this is an opportunity. This is a creature that imitates life forms. And it's probably been around the universe and has imitated everything. So we can make it anything and everything. It can do anything. So this guy's head pulls off, turns upside down, grows legs and 2 eyes, and crawls across the floor. And I started laughing. I said, you're kidding, aren't you? You're kidding, you know. You expect the audience to be scared by that? He said, sure. I said, okay, well, let's try it. And boy, were they scared by it.
After Mike Ploog storyboarded the kennel sequence, they began creating the unique effects. Bottin worked closely with Roy Arbogast, who made all of the mechanical contraptions for the monster's movements. If you look closely at the sequence with the dog thing, you'll realize that there's so much more to it than the big monster that is revealed near the end. There are puppets that deal with the various stages of the thing's transformation, the separate grabbing tentacles, tongue whipping, goo splattering, and not to mention the various fake dogs that would be victimized by the monster. These are all separate things that needed to be built. And this would also be the audience's first view of the fully animated monster in all its hideous glory. Because it's edited so brilliantly, it's easy to miss that we don't actually see any of the main creature effects in the same shot as the actors. When the actors are in frame, there are hints at the creature in the background or out of focus in the foreground. This was because something much more simple was used for the shots with the cast, and then there would be cuts to closer shots of the creature's various attributes that were filmed well after principal photography wrapped. For the kennel scene in particular, they filmed the effects out of sequence and in spurts over the course of a year. There was a specific reason for this that we'll go into a little bit later. A real dog was trained to come into the kennel and lay down in the center in a specific stiff pose that would mimic the pose of the initial mechanical dog that would begin the transformation. But get this, it seems things were actually toned down a bit because the transformation was supposed to begin with the dog having a violent seizure before its face ripped apart. They actually filmed this and Bottin thought it looked incredible, but Carpenter thought it would be much more jarring if the dog's head split open without much warning. The first mechanical dog thing, called the Meat Hole Dog, was operated by 17 technicians and began with the face splitting apart, revealing a skull that would fall away with a weird tongue thing behind it, and then it would grow spider legs and tentacles. The whole thing was operated with wires and pull cables just off camera, and Bottin and Carpenter had video monitors nearby so they could see how everything would look in frame. And here's a funny story. Stuart Cohen asked one of the sound editors how he got all the great sounds of the dogs howling, and the sound editor told him that his kids got all the neighborhood dogs together and brought them into his house, and he put on a trench coat and a big hat and went around outside of the house jiggling doorknobs and tapping on windows, and the dogs went nuts. But don't worry, because all the dogs got lots of treats when he was done recording. The main dog thing was actually done by the legendary Stan Winston. Winston had already received his first Oscar nomination for his work on Heartbeeps a year earlier, and like Bottin, he and his studio would go on to create some of the most memorable effects of the past 40 years. Bottin was under enormous pressure to complete the large number of special effects material in time. He was spread in all directions and having trouble keeping up with the demand. He was told to hire more people, but he didn't have time to supervise a bigger crew. Luckily, Bottin had contacted Winston in early 1982, not for anything specific, just to see if he might be available to work on something if they needed him. When things were about to fall through on the main dog thing effect, Bottin gave it to Winston to keep it from getting cut from the movie. Bottin was excited to see what Winston would come up with. Because of the nature of the thing, the guidelines were pretty loose, so Winston would be free to be as creative as he wanted. His guidelines were to make it recognizable that it is a dog, but distinct enough to fit with the other effects. Bottin was also glad to give up the dog thing because he had recently worked on The Howling and was sick of dog effects. Even though the actual effect was pretty simple, it's literally a hand puppet, creating the dog thing took 7 weeks of work. Winston began designing by taking a photo of his arm raised, and then drew his concept for the dog thing over his arm and head in the picture, so that the creature would fit how the puppeteer would be oriented. After this preliminary functional design, Lance Anderson drew a more detailed version to act as the main plan for the effect. Then they made a cast of Anderson with his arm up, and then Anderson, James Cagle, and Michiko Tagawa sculpted the creature in clay on top of the cast. When the clay sculpture was finished, they made a cast in foam latex and added radio-controlled eyes, snarling action, and cable-operated leg movement, but the main movement would be Lance Anderson puppeting it with his hand from under the floor. The dog thing was only shown to Carpenter and Bottin after it was fully completed, and Winston oversaw the filming. The kennel sequence was shot in North Hollywood over 2 days, and along with puppeting the dog thing's head, Anderson also puppeted this weird little chicken leg thing. Because there was so much slime covering the puppet, it was constantly dripping down Anderson's neck and back during filming. As if that wasn't enough, Anderson had to wear a leather helmet to protect him from all of the explosive squibs rigged to the thing to simulate the bullet hits. Winston chose not to receive a screen credit for his work to make sure that people understood that the masterful special effects work on the thing came from Bottin, and he deserves all the glory for that achievement. Bottin added a special thanks to Winston in the credits. For the other Huskies, Bottin and Arbogast made 15 mechanical dogs that used pull cables, puppetry, and reverse filming to create the effects they needed. The mechanical dogs were completed by Arbogast in mid-1981. For the shot of the tentacles grabbing the dog, they had urethane pull cables on the fake dog, and then had a couple of technicians hold the other end and run in the opposite direction. Then they simply reversed the footage. Sculptor Vince Prentice said, "The cables were slippery and full of goo, and very hard to get a hold of. I ran all the way to the stage wall and Rob kept yelling, 'Come on, pull, pull!' There was nowhere I could go, so I just started turning around and around, and I wrapped the cables around my body and legs. Then the cables let loose and smacked into me like giant rubber bands. Pwang!" In a promotional video, we can see an alternate version of this effect that somehow looks even more horrifying. Part of the big creature involved Bottin himself wearing latex arms that emerge from the dog thing and reach up to the ceiling. And this particularly horrifying effect that causes Childs to freeze in fear was referred to by Bottin as the quote-unquote pissed off cabbage. Funnily enough, if you've seen the 1951 film adaptation, The Thing from Another World, the thing's body is plant-based and referred to once as
an intellectual carrot. The mind boggles. Shouldn't.
Bottin originally thought of something like an eel for this effect, which was drawn by Mike Plug, but Ken Diaz saw something like this in another movie and pitched the cabbage design. We don't see it for very long, but the idea was that it would be like a blooming flower with 12 dog-tongue petals lined with canine teeth. The neck of the pissed-off cabbage was actually something they reused from Norse's stretching neck effect that Diaz found lying around the shop. They saved a lot of time reusing stuff they had already made, with Vince Prentice saying, "By the end of the project, we could walk into the foam room and make a whole monster out of all the parts that were there." Just as it was for Anderson, the slime was a big issue for Bottin inside the Big Thing monster. Diaz said, "We were using a lot of gelatin for all the goo, and the dog puppet just got covered. It turned into a real goo ball. One of the grips took some real old gelatin and stuck it in with the stuff Rob was using. The old stuff had mold on it and it smelled like rotten eggs. So Rob was inside the dog and we'd wrapped him in trash bags to keep him clean. He had all these hoses inside with him. John asked him to do something and all we heard was this glub blub sound. Somehow a hose wound up pointed toward his mouth and all that rotten gelatin was all over him. We hauled him out and he was just covered in goo. He could have been the thing."
I just want to be pure.
The kennel scene was like a kick in the face for the audience. and they were never the same afterwards. Both Carpenter and producer Stuart Cohen spoke about how, after the kennel scene, even small things like Blair getting injected got to the audience. People also couldn't take them collecting blood for the test by cutting their thumbs.
And this got everybody, too, in the audience. They couldn't stand the phony blood on the knife. I never could understand this. I thought...
Yeah, it's just the cutting, these simple little things after. I guess it's some sort of, I would say in the same area of comic relief. It's like if you're set up by other scenes to make you feel a certain way, then you do some little thing. All these things did pile up on the audience. I remember at the time they just
they were shook. They were shook by it.
It's done very subtly. I mean, it really is. It's not. I mean, the monster is so insane that it seemed easy to me to get past the monster and into the story of Paranoia, but at the time it didn't.
Cinefantastique noted that Friday the 13th Part 3, which came out a little over a month after The Thing, was a hit. The audience didn't seem to mind the violence and gore in that one. The reviews for The Thing were somehow even more harsh than The Thing was to those dogs. For his book, Phil Hoare collected a bunch of early critic reviews for the movie, and some of them are pretty great. Listen to this review by Vernon Scott. Lovers of grisly, gory movie mayhem will see their nightmares come true this month when The Thing is unleashed in theaters around the country. Blood, guts, dismembered limbs, entrails, fangs, slime, gizzards, severed heads, indescribable glop, bloody organs, and bizarre human-animal forms ooze, seep, peel off, and melt all over the screen in vivid, gaudy colors. Preview audiences cover their eyes, scream, groan, and moan. The transmutations are horrible to the nth degree, defying description. Audiences will find their skin crawling, their hair standing on end, and their stomachs heaving. They will be scared of this just short of cardiac arrest. Poltergeist, by comparison, is Laverne and Shirley. Phil Edwards praised the suspense building and wrote that Carpenter has shown himself to be a master filmmaker, at the same time noting that he can't remember seeing that much gore in a movie, saying that the effects, quote, represent a new dimension in mainstream cinema grossness. In his blog, producer Stuart Cohen wrote that the publicity department sent reviews from newspapers and magazines, and many of the reviewers were actually angry about the, quote, unrelenting gore at the expense of story, character development, and tension, and said that they were unprepared for the amount of anger unleashed on the film in general, or on John in particular. Editor Todd Ramsey said that it was similar when The Exorcist came out. It was highly unusual for that amount of disturbing violent effects to be in a mainstream studio movie with a great story. I will say that after doing a series on Alien, the slipping alien's chestburster scene in between the two shows that progression of brutal effects to support great storytelling. People had a hard time taking it in 1973 when The Exorcist came out, and in 1979 when Alien came out, but they certainly couldn't take it in 1982. I wonder how many of these critics got a chance to see how wrong the public eventually proved them. Letterboxd has it rated 4.4 out of 5 by 1.1 million users. In 1986, The Thing was shown on TV for the first time, but it was heavily edited despite being shown late at night. What's great is that the Shout Factory Blu-ray has the full TV edit of the movie as a special feature, and it is hilarious how much they cut up the movie. Just look at Norris's transformation in the TV edit.
Clear! Clear.
And they also redubbed all of the swearing in the movie.
The rest of this winter tied to this stinking couch! Do you believe any of this voodoo bull stuff, Blair?
The thing that's weird to me, though, is that they showed a lot of the kennel scene on Letterman right before the movie came out.
So then it's the story of a boy and his dog. Now, I noticed Paul looked away and people were gasping. That's a favorable response as far as you're concerned?
People were absolutely horrified by The Thing when it came out. Of course, today you almost can't even call The Thing a horror movie anymore. It's almost more like a sci-fi thriller action movie. And Carpenter said this back in 1998.
At the time this movie was released, this would have been in June of '82, it was considered a very frightening and horrifying and repellent film, and now we look at it and it's kind of a straightforward, tough, hard-hitting action picture with a monster in it.
The horror conventions aren't really scary anymore. The Fuchs sequence isn't scary. Blair Thing isn't scary. Okay, I'll say that the dog thing and Bennings are still pretty scary. But I think of the Norris and Palmer scenes more as brilliant story turns as opposed to scary, which I think is why I like them so much. It's the tension, paranoia, and how the men turn on each other that gets my pulse up. The gore isn't really scary because you see this kind of gore in action movies all the time. Interestingly, Carpenter complained about this trend as far back as the 90s.
I think it entirely depends on the story that you want to tell. I do know that in America at least, the horror film is kind of dying out as a popular genre because the action movie has stolen all of its techniques. If you look at a movie like Die Hard 2, and the slitting of the throat and so forth, and knives going in, they're right out of horror films. As a matter of fact, the director is a horror movie director. So Terminator 2 is basically a horror film. All those techniques that we used to use in horror are now in the big budget action film. So I think maybe the market for horror films is beginning to change, and at least it is in America. There are a couple of kind of yuppie horror films in America. Fatal Attraction is one of them. That the audiences go to see. I think they feel more comfortable because they know that they're not going to be disturbed by anything because Michael Douglas is in the film. You know, he's not going to do anything really scary to them, which is unfortunate. I think one of the good things about a horror movie is that you should never be quite sure what they're going to show you on the screen. It'll put you a little bit ill at ease, like, am I going to see something that's going to disturb me? Because frankly, horror is about fear, about frightening things. You should be scared.
You know, I've always wondered what makes the thing so rewatchable even after you know how it plays out. So I spent months breaking down every scene, story beat, setup, and payoff to pull the story apart and see how it works. The result is 120 pages tracing character arcs, story threads, central dramatic questions, and screenwriting analysis across 44 scenes. You can get it for just $5, or if you join Cinema Tyler on Patreon at the $5 level, you'll get the breakdown plus access to all of my bonus content. Or check out this video on the crazy story behind how the test audience almost ruined The Thing's ending.